The grand diner, the evening air was heavy with anticipation. As the humans arrived at the alien palace, it was an exquisite structure towering above them, its walls made of iridescent stone that shimmered under the dim glow of distant stars. The aliens had invited them for dinner, a rare event in the galaxy. Humans and aliens had never gotten along, and this dinner was seen as a chance for diplomacy to bloom in a tense and fractured universe. However, the humans could not shake the feeling that there was something more to this invitation than just a friendly gesture. The leader of the human delegation, Captain Thomas, was a battle-hardened veteran with years of experience in intergalactic diplomacy. He had faced countless threats, but the invitation to this dinner left him uneasy. The aliens, a race known as the Zorians, were infamous for their cunning and deception. Their technological prowess was unmatched, and their taste for games of manipulation was no secret. He had prepared his crew for this, knowing that the dinner might not be as peaceful as it appeared. The Zorians greeted the humans with a formality that bordered on the cold. Their golden eyes glinted in the soft light of the chamber, their smooth, greenish skin reflecting the soft hues of the crystal chandeliers. They led the humans to a grand dining hall where a long, oval table sat at the center of the room. The air was thick with the scent of exotic spices, and the gleaming surface of the table was set with crystal plates and cutlery that seemed to hum with an energy of their own. Each human was seated across from a Zorian, their eyes locked in a silent contest of willpower. The tension in the room was palpable. The humans were here to talk peace, but they knew that this could also be a trap. Captain Thomas had learned from previous encounters that the Zorians often masked their true intentions behind lavish displays of hospitality. As the dinner began, the first course was brought forward, a colorful dish of fruits and vegetables that seemed to glow with an unnatural radiance. Captain Thomas glanced at his crew, but none of them made a move to take a bite. His instincts were sharp, honed by years of experience in hostile environments. The dish before them was too perfect, too bright. He knew something was off. Without hesitation, Captain Thomas picked up his fork, twirling it slowly as he eyed the Zorians. They were watching intently, their faces betraying no emotion. The human delegation had not made a move yet, and that was exactly what the Zorians expected. The captain decided to take a small bite of the dish, letting the sharp taste roll across his tongue. Instantly, a sensation like cold fire shot through his body, but he kept his face neutral. His mind raced, calculating his next move. The Zorians were attempting to poison them. That much was clear. He could feel the effects already beginning to take hold. The subtle heaviness in his limbs, the sharp tingling in his fingers. But instead of reacting, Captain Thomas smiled and leaned back in his chair, taking another bite of the food as if nothing was wrong. His crew followed suit, mirroring his actions. Delicious, Thomas said, his voice calm and controlled. The Zorians exchanged a glance, their eyes narrowing, but they said nothing. They were confident that the poison would take effect soon, leaving the humans weak and vulnerable. It was part of their plan to deal with the humans once and for all. The conversation at the table shifted to the meal itself, as the Zorians spoke proudly of the ingredients used. This dish is made from a rare fruit found only in the heart of our planet's most dangerous jungles, one of the Zorians explained, his voice smooth like velvet. It has a unique flavor, unlike anything you've tasted before. Captain Thomas nodded, keeping his expressions as neutral as possible. He could feel the poison working its way through his system, but he was not about to give the Zorians the satisfaction of seeing his discomfort. He knew he had to act quickly if he wanted to turn the tables on them. The next course arrived, a steaming plate of delicate meat wrapped in leaves. It looked enticing, but Thomas could already tell that it was laced with the same poison. As the server placed the dish in front of him, the captain's eyes flicked to his crew, all of them now beginning to show the subtle signs of poisoning. Their movements were slower, their breaths heavier, but they maintained their composure, refusing to reveal that they were aware of the Zorians' plan. He couldn't afford to let the Zorians know that they were caught. Instead, Captain Thomas took another bite of the meat and then, with a casual air, placed his fork down. He looked directly at the Zorians across from him and smiled. "This meal is truly remarkable," he said, his voice steady despite the effects of the poison. "Where did you find the recipe for such a delicate dish?" The Zorians exchanged uncertain glances, clearly thrown off by the question. This wasn't the reaction they had expected. They had assumed the humans would fall into a state of weakness, desperate and confused. But Captain Thomas, with his cool demeanor, had thrown them off balance. One of the Zorians, An older figure with silver hair and a sharp, angular face cleared his throat. "It is a secret recipe passed down through generations," he said, clearly proud of his people's culinary expertise. "We believe it is the finest dish in the galaxy." Captain Thomas nodded thoughtfully, leaning forward just slightly. "I would be most interested in learning how it is made," he said, maintaining his calm. "The flavors are so unique, almost addictive. You must tell me how you prepared it." The request hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, the Saurians were speechless. It was not the response they had anticipated. They had expected fear, panic, maybe even anger. But the human captain was calm, unshaken, and oddly intrigued. He wasn't fazed by the poison. He was curious about it, as if it were just another part of their plan. As the silence stretched on, the Saurians hesitated. Captain Thomas smiled to himself. The first step of his plan had worked. He had bought himself time and set the stage for the next phase. The Saurians were no longer in control of the dinner. The humans had flipped the script, and the aliens had no idea what was coming next. And so, the dinner continued, the humans sitting calmly across from the Saurians as they attempted to poison them, while the humans prepared to take control of the situation in ways the Saurians could never have imagined. The suspicion-grossed silence in the grand dining hall stretched on as Captain Thomas and his crew maintained their composure. The Saurians, though outwardly confident, had begun to show subtle signs of uncertainty. They had thought their plan was foolproof. The humans, being naive and unaccustomed to the finer details of alien cuisine, would soon fall victim to their poison. The Saurians had gone to great lengths to ensure the toxin was slow-acting, almost undetectable at first, but deadly enough to incapacitate the humans before they could retaliate. But Captain Thomas had thrown them off balance with his calm demeanor, the last thing they had expected. As the second course of the meal was served, a dish of soft, pale blue fungi, the tension thickened, almost like a tangible weight in the air. Thomas remained focused, though the poison's effects were starting to become more noticeable. His fingers felt a slight tingling sensation, and his limbs seemed a little heavier than usual. The other humans around the table, however, were showing more pronounced symptoms. Some of them were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes growing distant, as if struggling to keep their focus. Yet none of them gave any indication that they were aware of what was happening. They were playing along, just as Thomas had instructed them to. As the dish was placed before him, Captain Thomas glanced over the strange blue fungi. It looked harmless enough, but there was no mistaking the pungent odor that lingered in the air. A foul, almost metallic smell that seemed to tickle the back of his throat. Still, he didn't react. Instead, he picked up his fork, taking a small piece of the fungi and bringing it to his lips. The taste was bitter and earthy, the texture slimy and unpleasant. Almost immediately, he felt a faint nausea crawl up his stomach, but he continued to chew it slowly, maintaining his neutral expression as he carefully swallowed. The poison, it seemed, was indeed in the fungi. A slow burn began to spread across his chest, but he didn't let it show. His mind was racing. He had to act fast. The Saurians were waiting for his reaction, and the longer he waited, the closer he got to feeling the full effects of the toxin. His suspicions were correct. The Saurians had no intention of making peace. They had planned to eliminate the humans before they could gain an upper hand. The dinner was nothing more than a trap, a means of lowering the humans' defenses. But Thomas was determined not to fall into it. "These fungi are fascinating," he remarked, glancing at his alien counterpart with a smile. "Where did you say you found them?" The Saurians exchanged looks, clearly surprised by the humans' composed response. "In the caves of our homeworld," one of them responded, his tone a bit defensive. "We have harvested them for centuries. They are said to be a delicacy among our people." "Truly?" Thomas replied, nodding thoughtfully. "I must admit, I've never tasted anything quite like it before. It's quite potent." He set his fork down, his hands trembling ever so slightly, but his face remained calm. "I'd love to know more about how you prepare it. It must take great skill." The alien seemed pleased by the human's interest, his golden eyes gleaming with pride. "It is a long process. The fungi must be carefully cultivated in a specific climate, then harvested under the correct lunar phase to ensure the right potency." Thomas nodded slowly, his mind whirling. He needed to buy more time. The other humans around the table were beginning to look increasingly sluggish, their eyes heavy as the poison took hold. It was clear that they needed help, but any sign of distress would confirm to the Saurians that their plot was working. Thomas knew that his crew would trust him to lead them through this. He had to keep his wits sharp, even as the poison worked its way through his bloodstream. So, Thomas continued, glancing over at the rest of the crew. How do you prepare the ingredients for each course? The flavor is so complex, yet so delicate. The Zorians, encouraged by the humans' fascination, began to explain the entire process in great detail. They spoke about their methods of fermentation, preservation, and even how they balanced different ingredients for the perfect taste. With each passing moment, Thomas felt the poison's effects intensify, but he kept his voice steady, hiding the tremors in his hands as best as he could. His head was starting to swim, the room feeling as though it was tilting ever so slightly. But the Zorians were so wrapped up in explaining their culinary traditions that they didn't notice. As one of the other humans, Lieutenant Hannah, began to lean forward, clearly struggling to stay upright. Thomas knew he had to make his next move. He subtly signaled to her with a small gesture, telling her to hold on. She nodded, though her face was pale, the poison clearly having taken a greater toll on her than the rest of them. Fascinating, Thomas said, keeping his eyes fixed on the alien across from him. Tell me, what kind of spices do you use to bring out the flavors in your dishes? The Zorians were eager to show off their knowledge, and they listed off a dozen exotic spices, some of which Thomas had never heard of before. As they spoke, he kept his attention on them, but his mind was already working. There was something missing in their story. The meal they were serving, these strange, almost alien dishes, had a certain sophistication to them. The recipe wasn't just a meal, it was a carefully constructed strategy, a weapon disguised as food. Do you have a recipe book? Thomas asked suddenly, his voice calm but urgent. I've always been interested in learning about different cultures' cuisine. Perhaps I could get a copy of your recipes. For the briefest moment, the Zorians froze, their eyes flicking between each other. The suggestion was unexpected, yet they couldn't resist their pride. Of course, one of the aliens replied after a pause. We have a collection of our finest dishes. It would be an honor to share it with you. Thomas smiled, but inside, he was calculating the next steps. The Zorians had provided him with a wealth of information, but now it was time to turn the tables. He had to expose their plan, but carefully. He couldn't afford to act rashly. The meal continued as the Zorians spoke, the poison slowly taking hold. Yet, as the seconds ticked by, Thomas couldn't help but feel a slight sense of victory. He had bought himself time and made the aliens believe they were winning. Little did they know, the real game had only just begun. The recipe request as the Zorians continued their conversation, oblivious to the humans' growing discomfort. Captain Thomas could feel the effects of the poison intensifying. His vision blurred slightly, but his mind remained sharp, calculating every move he made with precision. His crew was struggling, some of them now visibly swaying in their seats, but they remained steadfast, following his lead. Thomas knew that if he didn't keep up the fawade, the Zorians would realize something was wrong, and that would be the end of any chance for counterattack. His fingers tingled, and his chest felt heavier by the second. He fought the urge to let his exhaustion show, keeping a steady pace as the conversation flowed around him. The Zorians were talking about their planet's delicate ecosystems and the special methods they used to harvest ingredients from their dangerous jungles. Their pride was obvious, each alien relishing in the attention as they described the complexity of their culinary art. To them, it was just another example of their superiority, another way to prove that they were above the humans. But Captain Thomas wasn't fooled. He had been trained for moments like this, where the real battle wasn't physical but psychological. The Zorians thought they had them cornered, that their poison would incapacitate the humans and leave them at the mercy of their hosts. What the Zorians didn't realize was that they were walking straight into a trap. The humans had come prepared, and Captain Thomas had known all along that this dinner would be no simple exchange of pleasantries. How fascinating, Thomas said, cutting through the aliens' boastful words. He leaned forward slightly, his face breaking into a smile despite the overwhelming fatigue creeping into his limbs. I must admit, I've never encountered anything like it before. The flavors, the complexity of the dish, it's truly extraordinary. His voice remained steady, smooth, though his stomach twisted with every passing second as the poison worked its way deeper into his system. The Zorians beamed with pride, their golden eyes gleaming under the dim light of the chandelier. It is our greatest achievement, one of them said with a chuckle. Our ancestors perfected the methods, passed down from generation to generation. The balance of flavors is delicate. Too much of one spice, and the dish loses its potency. Thomas nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to keep this conversation going, stall them, gather as much information as he could. His crew was counting on him to turn this situation around, and he wouldn't let them down. I must say, I'm amazed at the precision involved, Thomas continued. It seems like it would take years to perfect a recipe like this. I've always had a passion for cooking, though I'll admit, nothing quite as sophisticated as what you've shown us. He paused for effect, then added, would it be possible to get the recipe for such a dish? The question hung in the air, and for a brief moment, the Zorians froze, their eyes widening in surprise. It was the last thing they had expected the human captain to ask. The humans were supposed to be unraveling in pain by now, their systems slowly shutting down as the poison coursed through their veins. Instead, they were being polite, inquisitive even. They were acting as though they were genuinely interested in learning how to prepare a deadly meal. For a moment, there was hesitation. The Zorians exchanged quick glances, their expressions flickering between confusion and amusement. One of them, a younger male with a scar running across his cheek, spoke first. You want the recipe? He asked, his voice dripping with incredulity. But why? Why would you want to know how to recreate the dish that will incapacitate your people? Thomas smiled. It was a calm, almost polite smile. Why not? He replied. If anything, I think it would be a testament to your people's abilities if we were able to recreate it. We humans pride ourselves on our ability to adapt and learn. I imagine a recipe like this could be valuable for us in the future. The younger Zorian seemed to mull over the suggestion, but then the elder Zorian, the one with silver hair, spoke up. His tone was more calculated, his eyes narrowing as if he were weighing his options. Our recipe is more than just a meal, he said slowly. It's a secret, a part of our culture. It's not something we share easily. Why would we give you something so precious? Something that could be used against us? Thomas leaned back in his chair, the poison now fully working its way through his system. He felt dizzy, but he remained in control. But you see, that's where you're mistaken, he said, his voice steady. It's not about using it against you. It's about understanding your culture. There's no harm in learning from each other, is there? I mean, you invited us here to break bread together. Why not share your knowledge with us? The Zorians exchanged looks again, and for a moment, Thomas could see the cracks in their confidence. They had assumed that the humans would crumble under the effects of the poison, but instead, they were being faced with a calm, collected group that was not only surviving, but thriving in the midst of danger. They were not the weak, desperate creatures the Zorians had expected. The elder Zorian sighed, his posture slumping slightly. Very well, he said reluctantly. You have proven more resilient than we expected. I will give you the recipe, but you must understand that it is a deeply sacred process to us. It's not just about the ingredients, it's about the harmony between them. Thomas nodded, his eyes never leaving the elder Zorians. I understand. I assure you, we will treat it with the respect it deserves. He smiled again, but this time there was an edge to it, a hint of victory that the Zorians could not see. As the elder Zorian began to speak about the recipe, Thomas listened intently, committing every word to memory. The ingredients, the method, the exact timing of each step, everything was laid out before him. It was a puzzle, and he was piecing it together one word at a time. He could feel his mind racing, calculating how this information would serve him in the moments to come. The Zorians were still caught up in their pride, their belief that the humans would fall to their trap. They didn't realize that they had just handed Captain Thomas the keys to their defeat. The recipe wasn't just a means of survival, it was a tool, a weapon that he could turn against them in the most unexpected way. As the Zorians continued their explanation, Thomas glanced around the table at his crew. They were struggling, their eyes half-lidded and their movements slow, but they were still conscious. They were still fighting, and that was enough. He would get them out of this. He would turn this dinner into the Zorians' greatest mistake. The turnaround Zorians, oblivious to the plans unfolding before them, continued to explain the intricate details of the recipe. Captain Thomas, though feeling the full effects of the poison now, remained sharp, his focus unwavering. Every word they spoke, every tiny detail they revealed, brought him closer to his goal. Their pride was their downfall, and he was determined to exploit it. The poison coursed through his veins like a fire, but Thomas could feel his resolve growing stronger with each passing second. His hands trembled slightly as he pushed his plate away, pretending to be affected by the meal. His crew followed suit, each of them continuing the charade as they tried to stay upright and alert. They could feel their limbs growing heavy, their eyes growing blurry. But none of them broke the act. They were survivors, and they weren't going to let the Zorians see their weakness. "Do you ever worry about the risks of such a delicate recipe?" Thomas asked, his voice calm despite the growing pressure inside his chest. He had to keep them talking, keep them distracted. He had no intention of falling into the trap they had set for him and his crew. A mistake in the preparation could easily spoil everything, right? The Zorians looked at each other for a brief moment, their eyes flicking with uncertainty. The younger one, who had been more vocal earlier, spoke up again, trying to regain his confidence. "The balance must be perfect. If we miss even the smallest detail, it could destroy the dish completely. But the risks are what make it so valuable." Captain Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "And what happens if the recipe is misused?" he asked, his voice steady. "Is there a way to counteract the effects of the dish if someone were to accidentally consume too much of it?" The elder Zorian's expression shifted slightly, his lips tightening. "That is a very rare occurrence," he replied, his voice now colder. "And even if it did happen, it would be impossible to reverse the effects once they've set in." Thomas smiled, though his body felt like it was slowly giving way to the poison. He couldn't let the Zorians see it, though. He had to keep his composure. He had to show them that they were no longer in control. He leaned back in his chair, stretching slightly, though his muscles ached with every movement. "I find that hard to believe," he said softly. "You seem to have all these advanced technologies. Surely, you've found a way to reverse the effects of such a potent dish." He let the words hang in the air for a moment, watching as the Zorians exchanged quick glances. The elder Zorian's eyes narrowed, and his voice grew more guarded. "Our methods are foolproof," he said, the tension rising. "You should be thankful that we decided to share this with you at all. We could have left you to your fate." Thomas ignored the growing suspicion in the alien's voice, keeping his expression neutral. "Thankful, of course, we're thankful," he said, his voice dripping with sincerity. "But I'm sure you can appreciate the desire for more knowledge. After all, isn't that what this dinner is all about? Sharing knowledge and learning from one another." The Zorians, still caught in their pride, seemed to relax slightly. They had been convinced that the poison would take effect soon, and they were beginning to let their guard down. Thomas, however, was already planning his next move. He had to act quickly. The time for words was coming to an end. Captain Thomas turned his gaze to his crew, subtly signaling them to prepare. They had no antidote, at least, not yet, but he had a plan. He could feel the poison still spreading, but he had bought enough time. He had learned enough about the Zorians' methods to turn their own weapon against them. The moment the Zorians turned their attention back to the recipe, Captain Thomas subtly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small vial hidden from their sight. It was the antidote they had prepared in advance, and though it wasn't the perfect solution, it was enough to buy them time. He would have to trust in his crew's strength to hold on just a little longer. "Tell me," Thomas continued, as though nothing had changed, "do the Zorians ever share their knowledge with other species?" His tone was casual, yet probing. "I imagine you must have some very valuable recipes. Surely, there must be others who would be interested in them." "No." The Zorians, still caught up in their pride and self-importance, began to elaborate further, their voices growing more animated. "We only share with those we deem worthy," the elder Zorian said. "But humans, you are an interesting case. Perhaps you are worthy of more than you realize." Thomas' smile widened, though internally, he was preparing for the moment when the poison would completely take hold. He needed the Zorians to believe that they had won, that they had outsmarted the humans. Once they were fully convinced of their superiority, it would be the perfect moment to strike out. As the conversation continued, Thomas' thoughts raced. The poison was already starting to cloud his thoughts, but he focused on the task at hand. He glanced at his crew again, seeing them struggle, but they were still with him. They were still holding on. The Zorians continued to speak, but their words became background noise. Thomas was no longer listening to them. His focus was on the vial in his hand. He had learned all he needed to know. The Zorians had given him everything he could use to turn this situation around. Now, all that was left was to wait for the right moment. Then, as the conversation droned on, a small shift in the room occurred. Thomas could feel the change in the atmosphere. The Zorians' confidence was no longer as solid as it had been at the beginning. They were starting to realize that the humans weren't acting like they had expected. The captain wasn't succumbing to the poison. He wasn't desperate. In fact, he was getting stronger by the second. The antidote slowly starting to counteract the effects of the toxins in his bloodstream. It was almost time. The Zorians were talking less now, their words faltering as the realization sank in. They had underestimated the humans, they had made a critical mistake, and Captain Thomas was going to make sure they paid for it. Your recipe is most impressive, Thomas said, his voice now firm and commanding. But now, I think it's time we show you something equally impressive. The Zorians looked up at him, their golden eyes narrowing as they realized that the tables had turned. Thomas was no longer playing their game. He was setting the terms of the encounter, and the Zorians would have no choice but to follow. With a calm, deliberate motion, Thomas placed the vial on the table, his eyes locking with the elder Zorians. You see, he said softly, we knew about the poison all along, and now we have the antidote. This dinner, which you thought would be your victory, is actually your defeat. The truth comes out. The Zorians froze, their expressions flickering, from confusion to disbelief, as they watched Captain Thomas calmly place the vial of antidote onto the table. The atmosphere in the dining hall shifted, the air thick with tension. The humans had known all along, and the Zorians were realizing that their carefully laid plans had just unraveled. Before their eyes, the captain's voice, steady and firm, carried through the room like a weighty verdict. You thought you could poison us, Thomas said, his voice cutting through the silence. You thought we'd be helpless, that we'd fall prey to your little trap. But you made a mistake. The elder Zorian's golden eyes narrowed, his lips pressed tightly together. What do you mean? He asked, though his voice betrayed the anxiety beginning to creep in. What is that vial? Thomas didn't answer immediately. He let the question hang in the air, savoring the moment as the tension in the room continued to build. The Zorians, once so confident in their ability to control the dinner, now found themselves at a loss. They were unsure how to react, unsure what this revelation meant for them. One of the younger Zorians, his face flushing with frustration, leaned forward, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. This isn't possible. You should have succumbed to the poison by now. You're supposed to be weak. How did you know? Captain Thomas didn't flinch. His hands were steady as he pushed the vial closer toward the center of the table. We've been trained to recognize threats, he said simply, and we knew what kind of game you were playing the moment we stepped foot on your ship. The question wasn't whether we would survive, but whether you would realize it before it was too late. For a moment, the Zorians said nothing. The realization that their plan had failed began to settle over them like a heavy blanket. They had been so sure, so confident in their superiority, that they had never even considered the possibility that the humans might be able to outsmart them. It wasn't just that they had underestimated humanity, it was that they had never fully understood the nature of their enemy. The humans were resilient in ways the Zorians had never anticipated. The elder Zorian finally spoke, his voice now tinged with desperation. What do you want from us? He asked, his eyes flicking nervously toward the vial. You've exposed us. What do you intend to do with this knowledge? Thomas looked at the vial for a moment, as if contemplating the answer. What we want, he said slowly, is the truth. You didn't invite us here for peace, did you? This was never about diplomacy. This was about control. You wanted us to be weak, to fall into your trap, to show us how easily we could be eliminated. But instead, we've turned your game around. The younger Zorian, still visibly shaken by the turn of events, stood up abruptly. You think you've won, he spat. This isn't over. You can't just expose us and walk away unscathed. Thomas remained calm. We don't need to walk away unscathed. We're here for one thing, survival. And we've made it through your little game. Now, we'll leave here, and we'll go back to our ships, and we'll tell our people about the Zorians, and their attempts to poison us. The Zorians exchanged tense glances. The younger one looked like he might protest, but the elder Zorian stopped him with a sharp glance. There was a growing realization in their eyes that this encounter was not going to end the way they had planned. You've made a critical mistake, Thomas continued, his voice steady. Underestimating us, thinking that you could outwit us with something as trivial as food. You have no idea what humanity is capable of when we are pushed to our limits. The elder Zorian clenched his fists, his frustration bubbling over. We did not expect you to be this resilient, he admitted, his voice low. We thought you were nothing more than primitive beings, incapable of understanding the intricacies of advanced cultures. But you've proven us wrong. Thomas nodded, acknowledging the admission. And that's what you need to understand. Humanity isn't just about technology or strength. It's about adaptability, about our ability to turn every challenge into an opportunity. This wasn't just about surviving your poison. It was about proving to you that we will always find a way to survive. The younger Zorian, still unable to contain his frustration, stepped forward, his voice trembling with anger. "You think this is over? We will never forget this. You humiliated us. You've exposed our weakness." Thomas leaned forward slightly, meeting the Zorian's gaze with a calm intensity. "No," he said, his tone firm. "You've exposed your own weakness. You assumed that we were the prey, that we were the ones who would fall. But in the end, you're the ones who are vulnerable. You've shown us exactly how easy it is to manipulate you, how easy it is to turn your pride and arrogance against you." For a long moment, the Zorians remained silent, the weight of Thomas' words sinking in. The room was heavy with the realization that the humans had not only survived, they had come out on top. The Zorians had underestimated humanity, and now they had to face the consequences of their arrogance. Finally, the elder Zorian spoke, his voice quiet but resigned. "What do you want from us now? You have won. You have exposed us for what we are." Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression softening slightly. "What we want is simple," he said. "We want peace. But not at any cost. We want peace on our terms. We want to know that when we sit at the table with another species, we are not being poisoned or manipulated. We want to build a future where both of our peoples can thrive. But it has to be based on mutual respect, not deceit." The elder Zorian nodded slowly, his expression one of grudging acceptance. "We have learned a valuable lesson," he said, "one that we will not soon forget." Thomas smiled, though it was not a smile of victory. It was the smile of someone who had seen the cost of arrogance and had come through it stronger. "Good," he said. "Then let's make sure we don't forget this lesson. We'll leave here, and we'll go back to our people. We'll spread the word about what happened, and maybe, just maybe, we'll see the start of a new chapter between our two races." With that, the human delegation stood up, their movements slow but deliberate as they prepared to leave. The Zorians, though defeated, watched them go, their minds racing with the realization that they had just been outsmarted by a species they had thought to be inferior. As the humans left the room, Captain Thomas turned one last time to the elder Zorian, his gaze steady and unwavering. "This isn't the end," he said quietly. "This is just the beginning." The poisoned Rever said humans walked away from the dinner, their steps measured, though their bodies were still feeling the aftereffects of the poison. As they moved through the halls of the Zorian ship, the antidote began to work its magic, slowly counteracting the toxins that had threatened to bring them down. Captain Thomas could feel the fog in his mind slowly lifting, the tightness in his chest easing as the antidote coursed through his veins. His muscles, once heavy and sluggish, regained their strength, and the dizziness that had clouded his vision cleared. The Zorians, still reeling from the events of the evening, watched from the windows of the grand dining hall as the humans made their way toward the exit. Their faces were a mixture of frustration, confusion, and humiliation. The humans had turned the tables, and the Zorians were left to ponder just how they had miscalculated everything. They had underestimated humanity in every way, assuming that the humans would be too weak to fight back, too predictable to break free from their trap. But the humans had done exactly what they did best. They adapted, they survived, they turned every advantage the Zorians thought they had into a weakness. And now, the Zorians were left with nothing but their pride and their shattered illusions of superiority. Captain Thomas and his crew reached the exit bay of the ship, where their own vessel awaited. The crew was still reeling from the effects of the poison, but they were holding strong. The antidote, while effective, had not fully restored them yet. The captain could tell that their journey back to their own ship would still be a struggle, but they had made it this far. They had beaten the Zorians at their own game. "All right," Thomas said, his voice steady, though the exhaustion was starting to creep in. "Everyone stay sharp. We've won this round, but the Zorians will be watching us. We need to make sure they know this isn't the end. They need to understand that they can't just toy with humanity like this and expect us to roll over." His crew nodded in agreement, their faces a mix of determination and relief. They had been through a lot, but they had come out on top, and that, more than anything else, gave them strength. As they boarded their ship and began the process of leaving the Zorian vessel, Thomas took one last look at the grand hall where the dinner had taken place. The Zorians, once so sure of their dominance, were now nothing more than a distant memory. The human captain had left them with a message they wouldn't soon forget. Back aboard their own ship, the crew gathered in the command center, the atmosphere now filled with a mixture of triumph and relief. The antidote had worked, and though the effects of the poison were still lingering, they were no longer in immediate danger. Thomas stood at the front of the room, his eyes scanning the faces of his crew. "Everyone did well tonight," he said, his voice firm but filled with pride. "We've shown the Zorians what humans are made of. We've shown them that we can adapt, survive, and overcome whatever they throw at us. But this isn't just about survival. It's about sending a message." The crew members nodded, their faces set with determination. They knew what was at stake. They knew that this encounter wasn't just about getting through the dinner and surviving the poison. It was about proving to the Zorians and to the rest of the galaxy that humanity was not to be underestimated. "We didn't just survive," Thomas continued, his voice growing more intense. "We outsmarted them. We turned their own plan against them. We made them realize that they can't simply prey on us because they think we're weak. We're not weak. We're adaptable, we're resourceful, and we're strong. And that's the message we're taking back with us." The crew stood a little taller, a sense of pride swelling in their chests. They had proven themselves, not just to the Zorians, but to each other. They had faced a dire situation and come out on top. And they had done it together. As the ship began to leave the Zorian vessel behind, Captain Thomas couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. The Zorians had thought they were playing a game. They had thought they could easily poison the humans and walk away victorious. But the humans had turned the game around, using the Zorians' own arrogance against them. It was a victory for humanity, and it was a reminder to the galaxy that humans were not to be underestimated. The Zorians had made one critical error. They had assumed that their strength, their technology, and their culture were enough to overpower the humans. They had assumed that they could manipulate humanity into submission. But what they hadn't accounted for was humanity's ability to learn, to adapt, and to fight back when pushed to the brink. Captain Thomas stood at the helm of his ship, staring out at the stars ahead. He knew that there would be more challenges ahead. The galaxy was filled with dangers, and humanity was still just beginning to make its mark on the vast, unknown expanse. But one thing was clear: humanity was no longer just a pawn in the galaxy's game. They had proven that they could stand up to the most powerful species and survive. And that was only the beginning. As the ship sailed into the vastness of space, Captain Thomas couldn't help but feel that the Zorians were only the first of many who would come to realize that humanity was not to be taken lightly. "We've made it through this," Thomas said quietly to himself, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "And we'll make it through whatever comes next." The stars streaked by as Captain Thomas and his crew made their way back through the vast emptiness of space. The Zorian vessel was now far behind them, a distant memory of a dinner that had turned into something much more than they had expected. The humans had come out victorious, but their victory was not just in survival, it was in the message they had sent to the galaxy. Humanity was no longer a species to be underestimated. They had proven themselves, not just to the Zorians, but to everyone watching from the shadows of the universe. Captain Thomas stood at the helm of the ship, his hands resting lightly on the controls as he gazed out at the stars. His mind was still processing everything that had happened over the past few hours. The Zorians had played their hand, thinking they could easily poison the humans and walk away with a simple victory. But what they hadn't counted on was humanity's resilience, adaptability, and resourcefulness. They had thought they were dealing with a primitive species, but what they had encountered was a species capable of surviving in the most dire of situations and turning the tide in their favor. Behind him, his crew members were scattered across the command center, each one recovering from the effects of the poison. The antidote had worked, and the symptoms were now fading. But there was no mistaking the sense of accomplishment that filled the room. They had faced down a powerful alien species, had been poisoned in the process, and had turned the tables on their would-be captors. And now, they were heading back to their home base, their mission complete. "Status report," Captain Thomas said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet pride. Lieutenant Hannah, who had been one of the first to show signs of the poison's effects, looked up from her station. "We're clear of Zorian space, Captain. The antidote has worked, and we're all recovering. The crew's stabilized. I've begun the analysis of the Zorian ship systems and data. We should have a full report within the next few hours." "Good," Thomas said, nodding in approval. "We'll make sure we have everything we need. I want the Zorians to know that we don't forget these things. We'll take their technology, their intelligence, and we'll use it to our advantage. But we'll also send a message that this isn't over, not by a long shot." His tone was firm, resolute, and there was a fire in his eyes that his crew had come to recognize. They had faced the Zorians in their most vulnerable moment, and they had come out on top. Now, it was time to make sure the entire galaxy knew what had happened. They weren't going to let this victory fade into the background. This was a turning point. Lieutenant Hannah nodded. Understood, Captain. I'll make sure we have the necessary intel ready for the report. The ship's engines hummed beneath them as they continued to drift further from the Zorian ship, the vastness of space stretching out before them like a blank canvas. The crew knew that there were many more challenges ahead. The galaxy was a dangerous place, and the Zorians were not the only powerful species out there. But the humans had learned something crucial in their encounter with the Zorians. They had learned that they were not helpless, they were not weak, they were survivors, and they would always find a way to turn the tables on their enemies. Captain Thomas turned his gaze back to the stars, the silence of space surrounding him. It was a quiet, tranquil moment. But beneath the calm exterior, a storm was brewing. This was just the beginning. The Zorians had been the first to make the mistake of underestimating humanity. But they would not be the last. The galaxy was vast, and there were many more species out there who would look at humanity with the same arrogance the Zorians had. But the humans had learned an invaluable lesson. They had learned to fight back, to adapt, and to never give up in the face of overwhelming odds. They had learned that even when the odds seemed insurmountable, they could still come out on top. We've proven something tonight, Thomas said quietly, almost to himself. We've proven that humanity is not a species to be taken lightly. We've shown the Zorians that they can't just poison us and get away with it. And we've shown them that when we fight back, we don't just survive, we win. A sense of pride filled the room. As his crew absorbed his words, the Zorians had made a critical error, and now they were paying the price. But the humans were not done yet. They were only getting started. As the ship cruised through the stars, Thomas couldn't help but think about the future. The Zorians had underestimated humanity, but that wouldn't be the last time it happened. There would be others who would test them, who would think they could take advantage of humanity's perceived weakness. But those species would learn the same lesson the Zorians had learned. Humanity was not something to be toyed with. Get ready, Thomas said, his voice firm and confident. We've made our point with the Zorians. Now, we take the message to the rest of the galaxy. Let them all know what happens when you underestimate humanity. He turned away from the helm, his eyes scanning the faces of his crew. They had come through this ordeal together, and they had emerged stronger than ever. They had sent a message, and it was one that would resonate throughout the galaxy for years to come. And as the ship continued its journey through the stars, Captain Thomas couldn't help but feel a sense of calm wash over him. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Humanity was no longer the underdog. They were the ones to watch. The galaxy would know their name, and it would learn to fear the resilience, the intelligence, and the strength of the human spirit. Let them come, Thomas muttered to himself, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. We're ready. The final message as the stars glittered beyond the vast expanse of space Captain Thomas stood at the helm, his hand steady despite the lingering effects of the poison. Still buzzing in his veins, his mind clear as ever, the crew around him worked tirelessly, making their way further into the unknown beyond the Zorian vessel. The silence of space filled the ship, the hum of the engines providing a steady rhythm to their journey back to safety. But the captain knew this was not just a return to normality. This was a statement. They had made their mark on the Zorians, and now they had to ensure the whole galaxy understood if Zorians had made a grave mistake. They thought they could poison humanity and have the upper hand, but they had underestimated one thing: resilience, humanity's ability to survive, even in the face of treachery and death. Thomas knew the message was clear. Humanity would not bow down. They would not be manipulated by the galaxy's more powerful species, no matter their strength or cunning. The crew members moved about the command center, recovering from the effects of the poison, their strength returning bit by bit. They had been through a lot, but they were still standing, and as they worked, they exchanged looks not of exhaustion, but of quiet pride. They had survived the dinner that was meant to be their downfall, and they had turned the tables on the Zorians, making them realize they were not the weak prey they had assumed them to be. Captain, what's next? Lieutenant Hannah asked, her voice steady, though she still felt the remnants of the poison creeping through her body. What happens now that we've shown them what we're made of? Thomas turned to her, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. Now we make sure the message is clear, he said, his voice strong and unwavering. The Zorians thought we were just another species they could manipulate, but they've learned a hard lesson today. Humanity is not to be underestimated. We don't just survive, we fight back, we adapt, we evolve. And we win. Hannah nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. We'll make sure the rest of the galaxy knows, Captain. Exactly, Thomas replied. We've proven ourselves to the Zorians, but this is just the beginning. We're going to make sure every species out there knows what happens When you underestimate humanity, the crew gathered around the command table, each one of them still processing everything that had transpired. The pride in their eyes was evident. They had faced certain death and come out on top. But this victory was not just for them, it was for all of humanity. The galaxy had just witnessed the strength of human will and resilience, and they would remember it. The ship continued to cruise through the stars. Captain Thomas allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. They had done it. They had faced an enemy far more powerful than themselves, and they had emerged victorious. It was a moment that would go down in history, a turning point for humanity. The Zorians had made a mistake in thinking that humanity was weak and easily defeated. They had been wrong, and now they would pay the price for their arrogance. But this victory wasn't just about proving the Zorians wrong, it was about proving something to themselves. Humanity could stand up to the galaxy's most powerful species and come out on top. We've shown them what we're capable of, Thomas muttered to himself, more to his crew than anyone else, and now they know we're not going anywhere. Let them come, he continued, his voice low but filled with conviction. We're ready. The words echoed through the room as the crew nodded in agreement. They had faced the impossible, and they had emerged stronger than ever. The Zorians had underestimated them, but humanity was never meant to be underestimated, and now the galaxy would know that. The universe was about to learn what happens when you try to poison the heart of humanity and think they can't fight back, because in the end humanity would always find a way to survive, to fight to thrive, and that was just the beginning. Then